Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video from a channel called Questioning Christianity, where they try to answer the question of whether or not God commanded genocide in the Bible. And this is a small enough channel that I debated not including the link to the original video, but I decided that they seem to be honestly trying to provide what they think are the best answers to some tough questions, and as such, they should be open to some discourse. I only ask that if you do decide to go there and leave a comment on their channel, that you be respectful. Also, a couple housekeeping things. First, my life is unusually hectic at the moment, so Monday videos are going to be somewhat erratic for a bit. Second, last week's video, as of this writing, is not performing very well. Ordinarily, this would just be a fluke that I'm happy to dismiss, maybe learn from whatever mistakes I made, but I actually punched myself in the dick in that video, so the pain that comes from it underperforming is more literal than normal. So go ahead and watch that one, please. My dick would really appreciate it. Anyway, let's get on to this one!
Our cultural memory is scarred by the atrocities of war, where the powerful in history have so often slaughtered the weak for nothing more than belonging to a different tribe or for the land under their feet.
Yep, people throughout history have done bad stuff like that. And what's more, it doesn't seem to matter what people group you're talking about, there is a history that includes such acts, though some people groups were definitely more successful at it than others. Since such acts are pretty much universally agreed to be morally bad today, one might even be tempted to use the term evil to describe them, then you'd think that the people that had a direct line to the God of the universe who is supposed to be our ultimate source for morality might stand out in history as being the one people group that, when they had power over another group, did not behave in that way. Alas, that is not what we see. We see the ancient Israelites being just as, if not more, genocide happy than other tribal cultures of the time.
Surely, if we have any heart left, we weep in the face of such evil.
Yeah, so one wonders why God commanded it so frequently, since this feeling of needing to weep when we hear about genocides allegedly comes from God in the first place.
So what on earth are we to make then when the trouble texts in the Old Testament, those ones where it seems like God similarly commands the genocide of the Canaanites at the hands of Israel's armies?
Well, the Amalekites are the example that I tend to prefer to use. It's the least ambiguous of all the examples. Thus says the Lord of hosts, now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. This is a command directly from God to commit genocide on a group of people as retribution for what their ancestors from about 400 years previously had done to the Israelites. And King Saul's failure to carry out a complete genocide here is what made God regret having made Saul king in the first place, which ultimately led to Saul being replaced by David later on. But yes, God did also command the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites.
These stories, as a Christian, they're hard to swallow, leading many to conclude that, if true, God must be a moral monster.
Yep, that is indeed the conclusion that one is led to here if we start off with the assumption that the Bible is actually accurately recording what God said to various people.
So how does a Christian story make sense of divine violence? Did God command genocide?
Yes, he did. He also directly committed it during Noah's flood, so even if you wiggle out of him commanding it by saying that that's just a history record of what the Israelite army did and the reasons that they gave, rather than it being an actual record of them having followed God's orders, God's still a genocidal maniac who destroyed greater than 99% of all life on the planet because humans turned out to be exactly what he would have known they would turn out to be when he made them. Well, I mean, to be fair, if we're putting the Noah's Ark story into its historical context, God had more limitations than modern Christians like to admit, so humanity turning out the way it did was a surprise to God in that story. He did not know it in advance, which still leaves him as a moral monster for committing genocide, but at least then it's more of a somewhat understandable overreaction than him just maliciously toying with his creations. Though, really, the phrase somewhat understandable is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, he's still a moral monster.
Now, I can't hide my extreme discomfort with imagining the death of so many people, drowned in floods, destroyed by fire, or slain with the sword. As historians like Tom Holland have pointed out, though, precisely why it troubles me so much probably has something to do with how we as a society have had our collective conscience so radically reshaped by the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth.
Really? When did Jesus come out and condemn the actions of his father? He does contradict him on occasion, but I don't remember him condemning the genocides. Now, I do remember Luke 24, where he says that if you don't hate your father, mother, wife, children, brothers, and sisters, you can't be his disciples. I also remember Luke 19:27, where he says, "But as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me." Sure, that one is in a parable, so it's easy enough to say that it has metaphorical meanings rather than Jesus literally wanting Christians to kill non-Christians, but seeing as how that verse was definitely used throughout history to justify the killing of non-Christians, I'm going to go ahead and say that the all-knowing God of the universe should have been able to see that one coming and so avoided it. Luke 22:36 also has Jesus telling his disciples to sell their cloaks to buy swords. So, while there are definitely teachings attributed to Jesus that could be described as at least moderately good, there were several that were easy to interpret as condoning violence in his name. And then even the good teachings were not unique to Jesus, with several religions having similar teachings that predate the Jesus story. The Golden Rule, which is usually the primary example that's brought up when talking about the good teachings of Jesus, because obviously so many of his teachings were so obviously good that you'd expect only one to ever be brought up repeatedly as an example. But anyway, the Golden Rule predates Jesus by at least 500 years, and is found in Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and basically every major world religion ever. Jesus never condemned the Old Testament acts of genocide that we all agree were morally evil acts. He definitely used language that would be conducive to continuing acts of genocide in his name in the future, and the good teachings that supposedly originate with Jesus that allow us to understand that genocide is bad actually originate with several older religions and aren't even really amazing revelations to begin with. So, can you really say that we wouldn't understand genocide to be bad without the teachings of Jesus?
It was into this dark and brutal world, full of warring gods and dehumanizing tribal violence, that Jesus celebrated peacemakers, not warmongers.
And what exactly is meant by peacemakers in that verse is up for debate, with some people going for the obvious someone who steps in between two people or groups who are in conflict in an attempt to begin the reconciliation process, with others going more for the if you knock the other guy out, he can't fight you anymore, so now there's peace interpretation. And sometimes you get the making peace when you make the other person believe in Jesus, because without Jesus there is no peace interpretation. So it seems that we are left with a situation where Jesus' message is not entirely clear, where the gospel authors sacrificed any potential clarity for linguistic style and flair.
Jesus rebuked his disciples often for their violent impulses, and he invited his followers to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies, and even pray for those who persecute you.
Yeah, Jesus sent mixed messages. I have no problem granting that. And the way his message was written left the door open for Christians to develop a persecution complex where they insist that they are being persecuted simply because they're being told that they have to play nice with people of other religions. And yes, sometimes even people of no religion.
A teaching Jesus embodied, when to those who crucified him he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Yeah, maybe in that moment he embodied it, but not too long before that, he could be found chasing people out of the temple with a whip because they were selling animals for sacrifice. You know that thing that God required all Jews to do at least once a year, offer a sacrifice at the temple? There were people there selling animals to sacrifice because buying an animal when you get there is way easier than packing up your sacrificial animals and bringing them with you. But nah, selling things in churches is bad enough to justify causing a public disturbance and violently ejecting people from them. Wait, sorry, temple, not churches. It's different when worship teams sell their albums and t-shirts in the foyer. Because reasons.
So while Jesus does warn of a coming judgment, a day where he will come back to deal with evil and restore justice on earth.
In other words, the day when he will come back and commit the largest genocide in human history, at least by raw numbers rather than percentages. It's only going to be second if we go by percentage. And you're telling me that God is not an immoral monster who condones genocide?
Undoubtedly, it is his legacy of non-violence and his compassion for sinners that makes me so uncomfortable with the Old Testament trouble texts.
Nah, man, I don't need Jesus to tell me to be uncomfortable with genocide. And can I just say, it's more than a little gross that you seem to get a bit excited when talking about that final genocide at the end of the world. It makes me doubt your conviction in the idea that genocide is always wrong and or evil. And frankly, if you need a belief in Jesus in order to continue believing that all genocides are wrong except for the final one that won't happen anyway, then by all means I would like you to continue believing in Jesus.
So what are we to make of them? Taking the military conquest of Canaan in Joshua as our test case, where in Deuteronomy 20:16-17, the Israelites were explicitly commanded not to leave anything alive in those cities.
I'm not sure how important this will be later on in the video, but Deuteronomy 20 is not specifically about Joshua's conquering of the Holy Land. It's actually the more generic rules of war. Though, to be fair, this is supposed to be the law as recited by Moses right before Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land, so these laws were definitely meant to be applied to that situation, but the whole chapter includes provisions for when they are settled in the Promised Land and how they are to deal with their neighboring cities as opposed to cities that are far away. The neighboring cities are the ones that need to be genocided. The faraway ones just need to be enslaved. Now, remember, in context, this is God's law, as recited directly by Moses before the Israelites entered the Promised Land. So unless you're willing to take more liberties with the text than most Christians I have experience with like to do, this essentially boils down to a direct command from God to commit genocide in some cities, and either the total enslavement or the partial genocide and partial enslavement of other cities, depending on how they respond to your threats.
Well, the problem for me as a Christian at face value is that it seems like I need to believe 4 statements are true, when the truth of any 3 statements logically invalidates the last one.
Okay, so it looks like we might be getting some actual concrete falsification criteria here. Good.
What are those 4 statements? Well, number 1, God is good. Number 2, the Bible is true. Number 3, genocide is evil. And number 4, according to the Bible, God commands genocide.
Yeah, okay, I can agree with that. The wording was a little awkward, making it sound like if any of the first 3 statements are true, then the last one cannot be true, but that is a very minor nitpick. But yeah, if you believe that God is good, the Bible is true, and that genocide is evil, then there should be no instance in the Bible of God commanding or committing genocide. And yet there are several, not just in Joshua's conquest of the Holy Land, but also King Saul's war against the Amalekites, Noah's flood, and depending on how we're defining genocide, Sodom and Gomorrah and the killing of the Egyptian firstborn. Those last 2 I don't think would technically qualify as genocide, but they are certainly mass killings that I would never describe as being good things.
Now, all 4 can't be true at the same time. So which one gives?
Well, I mean, as an atheist, I'd just go ahead and discard the concept of God altogether, which eliminates 3 of the 4. The God is good, Bible is true, and God commands genocide. The only thing we're left with is the idea of genocide being evil, and we could quibble about how we define and quantify evil without appealing to divine command theory in order to establish morality, but I don't think that's what this video is about, so I'll just leave it as the lone survivor of these 4 statements.
Do I question God? Question the Bible? Question my moral intuitions? Or question my interpretation?
You should always question all 4 of those things. Arrogance begins when you assume that you have absolute knowledge about something, and if you refuse to allow your mind to be changed when it turns out that you were wrong about something that you assumed that you did have absolute knowledge about. That's when you become not just arrogant, but an ignorant, arrogant asshole.
Well, let's walk through those options. Option number 1, is God really good?
Well, if we believe the Bible, then I'm going to go with a no on that one. Not just because of the genocide, but also because of the explicit approval of slavery, the misogyny, the advocating for beating your children, the over-the-top punishments for minor crimes like picking up sticks on the wrong day of the week, the punishment for that one is execution, the extremely tiny punishment for rather egregious crimes like the punishment for rape being in some situations to pay a fine to the victim's father and then to marry the victim, to the infinite punishment that he doles out posthumously for finite crimes, to providing infinite reward to people who committed heinous crimes in life, so long as they become his buddy just before they die, and I could keep going. So no, God is not good.
Because one possibility is to follow Richard Dawkins, who concludes that the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction.
And I would modify Dawkins' quote to include the New Testament, because Jesus didn't make it better. He slapped some superficially nice-sounding band-aids on a bad religious text, and then added the eternal punishment bit on top of that, while also saying things that could be interpreted as calls to arms in order to spread Christianity at the point of a sword. But yeah, God is, if not the most unpleasant character in all fiction, certainly pretty high up on the list.
Before going on to call him every name in the ad hominem playbook.
Now hold up there, Sparky. An insult is not automatically an ad hominem. An ad hominem is when you're using the insult as a part of the argument. That is, rather than making a logical argument, you base the validity of your argument on the attributes of the person you are arguing against. In the case of this quote, it's been a long time since I read that book, so I don't remember the full context, but if I recall correctly, that's the conclusion being drawn, not an argument in and of itself. So, for instance, to say that the God of the Bible is misogynistic is not in and of itself an ad hominem, especially since you can quote the Bible verses that support that position. So you could make an argument that has God's misogyny as the conclusion, without requiring an attack on God's character to be a supporting part of the argument. The rules that God laid out surrounding women treat them as property. People who treat women as property are misogynistic. Ergo, God is misogynistic. Now, if someone were to say that God doesn't exist because God is misogynistic, that would be an ad hominem. But I don't think that's the point that Dawkins was making there. The easy way to remember the distinction between just an insult and an ad hominem is to think of the example, "You're wrong because you're an ignoramus." That's an ad hominem. "You're wrong and you're an ignoramus" is not.
However, along with philosophical theists of various stripes, as a Christian I believe that God is in fact the source of all goodness.
Well then, if you believe the Bible is true, then you got a lot of explaining to do.
Which we see in the fullest revelation of God, where the invisible God became visible in Jesus.
I'm not sure that requiring a brutal human sacrifice before being willing to forgive people is such a good thing. Seems like just forgiving the people who sincerely regret the bad things they've done would be the better option there, and maybe not base forgiveness on the rather arbitrary question of whether or not you believe Jesus died for you, especially given that what religion a child will end up is very closely linked to what religion their parents were, so whether or not you believe Jesus died for your sins ends up being mostly a fluke of geography. So in the Christian model, a lot of good people end up in hell for a crime that essentially breaks down to being born in the wrong location.
Which means there is no wedge between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. There is only one God, made known in Jesus.
Yeah, and they're both morally bankrupt. Though there certainly were early Christian sects that would very much disagree with that assessment.
And so because of Jesus and the broad witness of the Christian story, I'm led to affirm that God really is good. We can trust him.
Hey, don't worry, you can trust me. I've forgiven you for everything by transferring your guilt onto my son, who I then brutally tortured and killed. Because if I hadn't done that, then I would have been forced to brutally torture you. I'm sorry, but I don't find that to be a good sentiment, nor would I find someone who thinks that way to be a trustworthy person.
So to me, option 1, it's off the table. Option number 2, is the Bible really true?
Well, considering the fact that it's just flat out wrong about a lot of historically and scientifically verifiable details, I'm just going to go ahead and say that it's not true. Though with the caveat that blanket statements like "it is true" or "it is not true" shouldn't really be applied to books like the Bible. After all, it was written over the course of almost 1,000 years from Job to Revelation, so we wouldn't expect blanket statements to ever be applicable to the whole thing, except in the most general sense. But sometimes the Bible does say true things, so dismissing the whole thing as not true is unhelpful. But as far as the overall message of the Bible, I'm going with no, it's not true.
Because some Christian scholars believe that because you cannot imagine Jesus presiding over the Canaanite conquest, that we must filter the troubled texts in the Old Testament through the lens of God's self-sacrificial love on the cross.
Or, since the Bible is verifiably wrong about a lot of stuff, we just discard the idea that it somehow is accurate as to the nature of God. That seems like the simplest solution, logically speaking.
As such, they conclude that while God intended to drive out the Canaanites non-violently, that the Israelites, in their own dark sinfulness, they misinterpreted God to be sanctioning genocide.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but forced relocation is basically in the same category as ethnic cleansing and genocide. And if your argument breaks down into quibbling over the technical definition of genocide versus ethnic cleansing versus forced relocation in order to make it seem like the thing that God wanted done wasn't really all that bad, then you're the bad guy. Now, that being said, I would like someone to describe to me how exactly you can force someone out of their home and out of their city peacefully. Because it seems to me that the only way that could be done is with the threat of violence, and there would likely need to be a demonstration that would show that the Israelites were willing to follow through on that threat. All of that aside, though, we're talking about God here. He is all-powerful, supposedly. He just, not all that long ago in the context of Joshua taking the Holy Land, put on a massive magic show in Egypt in order to free the Israelites. He kept them fed as they wandered through the desert. He stopped a rebellion within the Israelites by having the earth open up and swallow the rebels and their families whole. And yet, when it comes time to conquer the Holy Land, he wants it done non-violently for some reason, despite seeming to have a proclivity for violence up until that point, and is for some reason helpless to stop his chosen people from having misinterpreted his commands? Why could he not have just magically transported the Canaanites to a different location himself? That would have been a way better option than sending in an army that he knew would be misinterpreting his commands.
Now, whilst I sympathize with the struggle to reconcile Jesus with these events, I'm not comfortable throwing the Bible under the bus.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That was the option that assumes the Bible was wrong. So I guess you could just assert that any other time God showed his tendency for violence in the Old Testament, that was also the Bible being wrong. Which leaves me wondering what the point of being a Christian even is at that point. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would much rather every Christian on earth be the kind of Christian who is willing to discard the obviously bad parts of the Bible, rather than insisting that we have to adopt bad stances because they are the ones approved of by the Bible. But it just doesn't compute for me that an all-powerful, all-knowing God would allow such a flawed book to be associated with him.
Because in the Gospels, Jesus certainly seemed to treat the scriptures as though they were inspired by God and trustworthy.
I don't know, man. There are several examples of Jesus explicitly contradicting the Old Testament. For instance, Leviticus 24:19-20 says, "If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him." But in Matthew 5:38-39, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." He goes out of his way to explicitly contradict the verse in Leviticus. He could have just said the turn the other cheek bit without reference to the Old Testament, and then an argument could be made that it isn't contradictory because the two verses get applied in different social and or legal contexts, but by explicitly mentioning the verse in Leviticus, he has removed that possibility. Why would he bring up the verse in Leviticus before contradicting it, if not to say that it is wrong, do it this way instead?
So it seems to me a slippery slope to start picking and choosing which divine utterances in the Old Testament can be believed and which must be rejected as human error.
Well, Jesus certainly rejected at least some of them as error. Maybe not human error, maybe it was divine error, but error nonetheless.
So for me, I'm not persuaded number 2 is a live option. What about option number 3? Is genocide always evil?
I'm going to go ahead and say right now that yes, it is, unequivocally. And even if you approach this from a utilitarian perspective, where it's hypothetically possible that the elimination of a specific group of people will create a net benefit in the world, it's impossible for us to accurately make that determination, and the fact of the matter is that it is far more likely that it would not, so we must always treat it as though that is not a possibility. However, if it were possible, maybe an all-knowing God was able to do that calculation and determine that the world would indeed be better off without the Canaanites. The problem here is that this God is also supposed to be all-powerful, and if we're going with a purely utilitarian view of ethics, then eliminating the Canaanites quickly and painlessly would be the best option. Something that God could have done, but he chose instead to do it through conventional warfare, inflicting pain and suffering on his own chosen people in the process. And worth mentioning is that the people who claim that God is the ultimate source of morality can often be found pointing out the flaws in utilitarian ethics that can lead to just such circumstances. And yet, they will turn right around and unironically appeal to utilitarian ethics in order to justify God's actions in commanding genocide by pointing out that the Canaanites were doing bad things that needed to be stopped, and the things they were doing were so bad that genocide was a justified method of stopping them.
We need to understand this was not an arbitrary ethnic cleansing. But in fact, this is a specific judgment on a morally degraded people.
God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based, as the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies.
First, it starts off with incest, and then it goes into adultery, then it goes into offering your children to Molech, homosexual sins, and then bestiality. And we know from Canaanite primary source documents that all of these things were being practiced by the Canaanites.
He gives reasons, right? He doesn't just wake up like a mob boss and go, Canaanites, I want them dead, right? He's got reasons for it. And probably the biggest reason, after 400 years of warning, is that the Canaanites were sacrificing their children on the molten hot god Molech, this idol.
Other Christian scholars, they try to justify the Canaanite conquest by challenging our moral intuitions. They argue that while it is wrong for human rulers to play God, as it turns out, God is God. He's not playing God. And as the author of life and the judge of all humanity, as the only one who possesses perfect foreknowledge and wisdom to know how and when to intervene as the best possible course of action, well, God has the unique right, indeed the responsibility, to execute judgment.
Yeah, that's the appeal to utilitarian ethics that says that God has done the moral math and determined that genocide is justifiable in those cases. And if that's the route you want to go, that's fine, I guess, but you don't get to turn around and then ask the atheists where their morality comes from, because at that point we've established that morality is utilitarian in nature rather than coming from God. It's all about getting the best possible outcome that will benefit the largest number of people. Now, to be clear, pure utilitarianism is not the ethical framework that I subscribe to, though certainly I do borrow aspects of utilitarianism, but that is one of the most common critical comments on videos dealing with God doing bad things in the Bible. The Christians will then ask me where my morality comes from. And since God apparently gets his morality from utilitarianism, but utilitarianism does not require a God in order to work, then we should be able to agree that there is at least one moral framework that it is possible to appeal to without needing God in order to work.
Now, these scholars typically point to the depravity of the Canaanite culture, who were known to ritually sacrifice even their own children to pagan gods.
The thing about that, though, is that it's pretty commonly agreed by scholars that the Israelites did the same thing. There is certainly debate about how common the practice was, but within the text of the Bible itself, we can see that there were some groups who did and others who abhorred the practice. Abraham, for instance, didn't question God's command to sacrifice his son Isaac to him, which suggests that requiring child sacrifice was definitely a thing that would be within the character of God as Abraham knew it. God did intervene and stop it in that instance, but Jephthah's daughter wasn't so lucky. Jephthah promised that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house when he returned from war if God granted him victory. God then granted him the victory, knowing that his daughter would be the first thing out of his house, and did not intervene to stop the sacrifice. In 2 Kings chapter 3, we see the king of Moab, who is besieged by the Israelite army and in a hopeless situation where God has already promised to give the Moabites into Israel's hands. So he then sacrifices his son as a burnt offering, which had the effect of causing a great wrath to come against Israel, making them withdraw to their own land. Basically, God broke his promise to the Israelites in exchange for the king of Moab sacrificing his son. And while the verses that are often taken to be a command for the Israelites to sacrifice their firstborn children to God often come with the option of redeeming them for a lamb or money instead, there is one instance where no such option is provided in Exodus 22. From the evidence, it is incredibly likely that there were a not insignificant number of people in ancient Israel and Judah that did practice child sacrifice and sacrifice them to Yahweh, not Molech or Baal, and this practice was neither universally condemned nor universally accepted. It seems reasonable to me to think that Canaanite culture would have had a similar divide, with some engaging in the practice and others not approving of it. To think that a whole culture was 100% in favor of the practice of child sacrifice is to be incredibly naive and ignoring any possibility of nuance. Of course, in order to justify genocide using utilitarian ethics, it would have to be a completely unnuanced situation, so the apologists that choose this route are kinda stuck with it. But yeah, all this to say that I have my doubts as to the entirety of the Canaanite population being that evil and depraved.
And when it comes to the difficult question of non-combatants like women or innocents like children, these scholars typically appeal to the Christian view of eternity, where in God's mercy, those who are lost as collateral damage in these conquests, they could have their suffering compensated in God's future world.
Which is a really gross justification that could be used to justify the killing of children in any situation, even today. So yeah, I'd like to stay far away from that one.
Now, I think this view, as you may feel, it has difficulties, and it's often poorly parsed out.
Okay, I had hoped that he was going to reject it as he did with the other options, but it sounds like he's getting ready to defend it. I hope I'm wrong.
But I do think there is something to the need for justice, where a loving God cannot forever stand back and watch evil pervert his creation, with the incalculable cost that would mean for future generations.
God damn it. Okay, let's see what his justification is, whether he actually manages to do better than the disgusting examples of genocide apologists that we already saw in the montage. Maybe he'll get to be added to the montage.
And finally, then, option number 4. Did God command genocide?
Well, if we're going with yes, the Bible is true, then yes, unequivocally, he did, on several occasions. And that's not including when he directly committed it himself.
Well, there is a growing body of Christian scholars who argue that God's commands to Israel are better interpreted as a charter to exile the Canaanites for their evil, not exterminate them.
Forced relocation, something that is often a part of genocide, and is never an option throughout history that is not viewed as heinous and immoral in retrospect. Think Trail of Tears, the Armenian genocide, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar.
Just as cultures have been destroyed in every other forced relocation throughout history.
The only time when relocating people who don't want to move is not considered immoral is when the reason they need to be relocated is something like a natural disaster of some kind, and the people relocating them are actually helping them to survive. And that's not the type of relocation that's being described by the Bible here.
They point out that warlike hyperbole, it was a common feature of ancient conquest narratives.
I've usually seen that option taken as being indicative of the Israelites not having committed actual genocide, just conquering the territory in a normal warlike fashion. Because if they had actually killed all the Canaanites, then it would be a biblical contradiction that the Canaanites show up again after this conquest is done. And there is some merit to this position, but it doesn't really make the conquest of the Canaanite lands a morally good thing. The Israelites were taking over their land for no reason other than their God told them that they could. So the Canaanites were guilty of the crime of just trying to live their ordinary everyday lives in a location that God said he'd give to other people.
These scholars, they hone in on Israel's rules of war to show that not only were the Canaanites warned of God's judgment and given passage to leave, but that the Israelite conquest, it was aimed at military strongholds, not civilian population centers.
Except the rules of war that you're talking about here are the very rules of war where it is laid out that the cities close to the Israelites, that would be the Canaanite ones in this case, are to be completely and utterly obliterated and wiped out. No warning, no chance of surrender, kill them all. Sure, that could be hyperbolic, but if we're appealing to the rules that say they're to warn them and then take the inhabitants of the city as slaves in order to show that to be hyperbolic, then not only are you wrong because that example is placed there directly to contrast what you're supposed to do to the Canaanite cities, but also you now end up with innocent people being forced into slavery for the crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which, I can't believe I have to spell this out, but that's not a morally good thing.
And that the only non-combatants explicitly mentioned in the story, Rahab and her tavern-keeping family, they ended up being saved from God's judgment amidst Jericho's dramatic downfall.
It seems like a bit of a stretch that an entire military camp would only have one prostitute and her family living there that weren't non-combatants. Was she the only prostitute for all of those military men? And in Joshua 2:13, she explicitly states that her whole family is there with her, father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all who belong to them. Are we really to believe that only this one family were present as non-combatants and that everyone else there was a soldier? What was this one family even doing there? I mean, I can understand a prostitute in a military camp, though I feel like if they're given housing on a military base, then they'd probably want there to be more than just the one in order to satisfy the whole army. But then that leaves us with a bunch of non-combatant prostitutes that got killed in this story. And I don't buy this explanation.
So to me, this final option, swapping out extermination for exile, it certainly helps lessen the force of the question around genocide, even if it doesn't fully resolve the tension of the Canaanite conquest.
In other words, it's not that the Bible was wrong, it's that it's just wrong enough to still be technically right, while making me feel a little bit better about the genocidal passages, which are still immoral even in this view. So it doesn't actually solve the issue of God commanding immoral things, and it still ends up with the Bible being wrong about stuff. This solution seems like it's combining the worst aspects of two of the other solutions.
The truth is, honestly, I don't have a really comprehensive or completely satisfying answer on this question.
Right. And I know God doesn't promise to explain all his actions to us, so how dare we even ask or whatever. But I feel like the least he could have done would be to provide us with an actual satisfying answer to this question. As it is, it looks like the Bible is basically the same as other religious texts that have similar stories about their gods helping them wipe out other tribes. In which case, why should I believe the Bible over those other similar stories? Why should I believe any of them? I see no reason to.
Christian scholars who love Jesus and the Bible, they disagree, as we do on a range of things where the Christian story is not as clear.
The all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God of the universe couldn't manage to make himself clear on a bunch of topics. Seems like clarity in his message would be the absolute least we could expect from such a being, but he couldn't even clear that low bar. Do you know what other kind of God would have trouble clearing such a low bar? A non-existent one. Also, I mentioned the bar being low, so at this point I feel like I'm obligated to roll the William Lane Craig clip, even though Craig wasn't actually mentioned here.
Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
So while right now I lean towards appealing to some mix of options 3 and 4, I wouldn't die on that hill.
To paraphrase, I think this explanation makes the genocide okay, but I'm open to other explanations that will accomplish that. The one that I'm not open to is that the Bible just isn't actually a good book describing a good God, even though it clearly isn't.
But here's a couple of things I do know. While some detractors interpret the Canaanite conquest as ethnic cleansing, the Bible teaches that all tribes and all tongues are made in God's image and so are deeply loved.
So is that why God flooded the world and killed everyone except for 8 people? Is that why God commanded a much more explicit genocide regarding the Amalekites, where it is undeniable that he provided instructions to kill everyone, non-combatants included? Is that why he wiped out an entire city of people for the crime of either not being hospitable enough or for being gay, depending on who you ask? Is that why he actively hardened Pharaoh's heart, causing him to not free the Israelites so that God could show off his child-killing abilities? Yeah, sorry, the God of the Bible is an immoral monster, even if I grant that the Canaanite genocide wasn't actually a genocide. And I see no reason to grant that.
So whilst these troubled texts in the Old Testament, they're confronting to anyone with a beating heart, and perhaps remain somewhat unanswered, they still happen to be the exceptions in the Christian story.
Which, if I grant that point, makes them abusive as fuck. If someone generally treats their family well, but occasionally beats the living daylights out of them in some cases, the beatings are the exception rather than the rule. But that doesn't make it a healthy, happy family. Also, you essentially said earlier that these were falsification criteria, that in order to be a Christian you have to believe all 4 statements, and if any one of them is not true, then logically that invalidates Christianity. And yet here you are, waffling on the genocide is always bad statement, because you know that it is bad, and because you are more moral than the God of the Bible. But you can't say that, because then that means you have now falsified Christianity by your own admission. It's kinda sad, really. I wish that you were more free to be the moral person that you seem to be, rather than being the person that has to find excuses that make genocide okay, and who is hoping for the final genocide at the end of the world. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Ray S., who says, Alien Romans, also known as Romulans. So, Romulans crucified space Jesus confirmed. Thanks for watching, thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, DL, Zara Hancock, Kodon, Noja, and all the rest, who are the firstborn children that are sacrificed to the god that is my channel. If you'd like to be an excuse for genocide, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!